Now, ladies and gentlemen, it's time for a shift in our mindset. As Albert Einstein once said, no problem can be solved from the same level of consciousness that created it. Our next speaker will demonstrate that systemic issues call for a holistic approach. Please welcome Mr. David Korowicz.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you very much, Baz. Thank you, all of you, the other speakers, the organizers. It's a real pleasure to be in Budapest. So let's see if I can work this. In a historical blink of an eye, we've become ever more bound to an accelerating, expanding global metabolism, where each of us and each part depends through imaginable connections on other parts. And over the years ahead, we will have to deal with the fact that, firstly, this has made us vulnerable, and secondly, that vulnerability will be tested more and more as a growing range of stressors and sources of shock interact through those vulnerable systems. The challenge for us and for those who are saying, how can we face into this, is to think of what we might say is, how do we make decisions between what we know of escalating risk and uncertainty and the fact that we are stuck in the world we're in, of huge lock-in, socioeconomic constraints, cultural constraints, and really what we all kind of know is that mass change never really happens before a crisis. So somewhere between those two parts, we need to find not necessarily a route, but ways of responding that is attuned to the risk, accepts constraints where they are, and says, how do we move forward? So on the escalating systemic risk side, what I generally say is, I don't know exactly what's going to happen, but I know our complex interdependencies that we rely on, supply chains, critical infrastructures, human cooperation, etc., are vulnerable, and they will be tested by all sorts of things. And in a sense, what that's going to do is, if we are in Hungary, yes, we might have very particular, say, climate expected changes, socio-political issues, but the number one way we're going to feel this growing crisis is through our interdependencies, through our supply chains, through our critical infrastructures, etc., through movements of people. And we're going, so a world has been large-scale macro stability. That's why you can have complex just-in-time supply chains. We notice change. We notice the froth on the surface of life. We're less attuned to this ocean of stability underneath us. That's how this thing, metabolism, works. We're going from something that's been pretty predictable. It's an amazing piece of predictability. If you can assume you can go to the supermarket next week and there will be food. Lots and lots of things have to happen. If you're planning for students to be here next year, there's a whole myriad of conditionalities that we rarely give thought to, but they're embodied within the system. So we're going in a world of deepening uncertainty, where harder to predict, more downside uncertainty, and where the impacts of things are much greater than if we looked at just climate change, just energy, just social cohesion, just whatever AI is doing to amplify other risks, etc. How they interact is amplifying. Our vulnerability, our socioeconomic systems have tipping points and all of that sort of thing, so that's a new vulnerability. And as we know, like lots of systems, when you're ill, a small thing can knock you over. In other words, you can lose resilience, you can become more vulnerable with repeated stresses and shocks. So in a sense, our urgency is much greater than if we were just thinking of say, climate change, and we're saying, well, what do we do within the constraints of a world in which many things are bound for the moment? We can't expect a Damascene conversion of the population. Even in what I remember in 2007 and 2008, when there was the financial crisis, it was a credit crisis. It was as vanilla as could be. It wasn't something particularly exotic. And yet, afterwards, people are saying, well, why didn't we pick it up? That's us. That's the way it is. So, one doesn't, as Seville, one accepts it. For large parts of the population, unless you expect it, our expectations and the reality that's happening will expand. And because it's uncertain, because it's largely going to be negative, that's going to make people stressed, it's going to make people angry, it's going to make people disorientated. And even if you were a government and you said, I think we're probably near the limits to growth, and you stand up, I can say it because I'm just me, but if it is coming from people with authority, from government, and said, we're at the limits to growth, it won't take very long for people to say, firstly, so that kind of means the financial system is insolvent, doesn't it? Yeah, because it's a system for promising. Money is a system of promises based on future expectations. And they might say, well, hold on, if this is the way things are going, we're looking for investment from a poor region over here that needs employment and all of this sort of thing, and this will help our balance of payments and et cetera, et cetera. So straight away, they can introduce even more uncertainty and instability. And this can lead to, if it's not done very well, a type of reflexivity trap. People get stuck in not being able to do anything because they're afraid of articulating or frightening systems and people. And the other danger is, the longer you leave it, we said things are going to happen faster, harder. Well, what happens is you start losing capacity. Your capacity to adapt, your capacity to build resilience, and all of these sort of things can start falling from under your feet. So, enough of that. We want to know how to go forward. So, I'm going to give 8 suggestions. Its idea is to get people thinking, out, doing stuff. And the first one is focus on the trajectory or vulnerability. This is a simple map, if you want to call it that, or a little ecosystem of a society, and the things it depends upon, like its keystone species, or critical organs in a body, the heart, the liver. And you have things like critical infrastructure, the financial system, flows of goods and services. And they all interact. And that has a trajectory 2 times. So that could be Hungary's trajectory. And now it's not interacting with the rest of the world there. But we just want to focus on, we can't deal with every particular, a department of cybersecurity there, or a department of whatever. We just want to say, what happens, what is the risk to the disruption to these critical interdependent systems? That's our simplified thing, because that's what we interact with. We don't interact with abstract climate change unless it's very warm today, but through global climate change or energy shocks or wars, they infiltrate into the stability of this. If things go really bad, this whole thing collapses because, for example, if your financial system collapses, your flow of goods and services collapses. If flows of goods and services collapses, you're losing your infrastructure, etc. So that would be a collapse of an interdependent system. But it's just stress in that. So focus on the trajectory, all hazard. So there are lots of things no matter what happens. You've major flooding. There is a blackout. Many of the same things are part of response. The other thing is keep multiple risk realities and time frames in mind. So how complex systems behave as they stress, they're reaching limits, as there's more volatility, but it can go on quite a while. It's careful not to think that, we don't really know how long, like our civilization has been really resilient. It's a strong thing. That's how it's lasted through all these 2.5 centuries as it's accelerated. So we may be in a world where actually things turn around in the next few years for a little while. You don't know. You can't deny. We may be in a world of much more stress and shocks, which seems more likely. There can be localized disruptions like those system failures. So you're sitting at home and there's major flooding, and that cuts the power and your water supply, and basically the government is overwhelmed and nobody's coming to you for a week or 10 days. So how do you deal with that? How do you believe in even bigger sorts of shocks? So there's multiple things. Now, this is an extreme shock because it was work I did about 10 years ago. But it's how you keep multiple things in mind. It's an exercise. It's a game. It was done over quite a bit of time. And really, the brief was there's going to be a major catastrophe. It's artificial, but there's going to be a major catastrophe. And you've all been given secret information. It's going to happen in 3 years or 10 years. Now, actually, originally, there was also 6 months, but that was taken off because people found it a bit traumatic. But there's going to be a crisis coming, and you've been given a responsibility. If the system goes down, like a global financial system collapse, basically, nothing will start coming into the country. That sort of point. Critical systems will start failing, and you'll be on your own to deal with these crises. There may not be things coming in. Your job is to help us prepare. Now, if it's happening in 3 years, it's going to be very different if you're happening in 10 years. You've got more time. But the thing is, you don't know when something bad is going to happen. It's not going to wait for you until you're ready. So you keep multiple things there in mind so you can be prepared. And you'll see something else down there. We talked about reflexivity. Do you see it there? Where we mention you can't go telling people, in 3 years' time, everything is going to fall down around our ears, because it'll be like you start to inflict the damage, and actually then it might start falling apart in a much sooner time. So you see these sort of ways of keeping multiple things in mind. Don't worry about, we don't know if some things we could keep going on, etc. So the thing is, preparedness, there's always lots to do. The second thing is whole of society. Now, this has become a big concept in disaster and preparedness, that really in a more stressed and uncertain world, the old idea is, who's responsible for a crisis? Well, it's the people in government who are responsible for a crisis. They come down when there's a crisis, they fix things, they go away, and life returns to normal. But in a world of bigger crises, more frequent crises, or just long-term socioeconomic stress, where things are just getting harder, it's going to be something that more and more all of us will have to find a way, in some way or other, of playing a part. Now, countries, the Nordic countries, Sweden, Finland, have pretty well developed whole of society efforts originally through their total defense, about how does the country deal with a war, but also then expanded into how does the country deal with the crises. And if you're a church group, if you're the Scouts, if you're a sports group, you can all find a place to learn and play and contribute within those things that you do within your communities. And it's also, I think, when you have something where you have the scale of something like deep adaptation, the thing about top-down is it, because we really don't know what to do, it can be very prescriptive and it lacks texture. The thing about bottomed-up and networked thing is it can experiment more, it can empower more, and it can get people involved. It can do things that, top-down resilience and shock planning can't do. But also, it has the added benefit it can bring people together. It's to do things. People, I think, there will always be a part for people who kind of read papers and think about these things. But for lots of people, that's either, who's going to read a 40-page paper and think about these things? For lots of people, it's going to be, well, what can we meet? Can we talk? Can we do other things that are part of the broader expanse of human relations and cooperation and how they work together? One way I like of doing this is exercises, simulations, games. I'm sure in this sort of university of government things, there's been games designed here, there's been exercises run here, but usually these are things that governments do. So the Irish government did one related to the changes last year of what happens if there is a diesel interruption. Just diesel, but diesel is behind all our trucking, diesel is behind our farm systems. You lose diesel very quickly, you have a cascading problem to our society. Lots of governments have been practicing what happens if the grid goes down, given all the recent troubles. They're par for the course. Now, governments tend to be very sensitive about those. There might be a leaked thing in the paper saying government did an exercise, but it's not for the likes of broad society. But one of the things I think we really need is community-based, society-based things for all of you to do exercises, to be able to build exercises and simulations, because they bring people together and they simulate, say, major flooding in this community and say, how do we respond? And if the government isn't there straight away to help us, what do we do? And through those exercises, you learn about your vulnerabilities, you learn about your neighbours. You're coming together, you're dealing with the trauma of this sort of world by being active, by engaging, by dealing with, in some way, the risks around you. It's a way of processing what's happening as much as building preparedness. And those sort of exercises are across all different types. So I've used these with ordinary communities, and people really like it. One is because it allows them to deal with traumatic things in a practical way that they're responding, as I mentioned, with each other. But in a time when people are often frightened or feeling anxious, it gives people a sense of, wow, this is really important. And if there are two dichotomies of how we deal with crisis, one is the fear is, oh my God, what am I going to do? Beans in the larder. It's very deep. Social radius contracts, time contracts. The other one is, I think, a more expansive one is to say, well, how can I help? And we're all much better prepared if we say, wow, how can I help? It's pro-social, it brings us out into the world, and it's true. So the development of serious games, good thing. Anticipate, be the people with a plan. I can tell you one of the things that's probably pretty likely is at some stage there's going to be lots of unemployment after crises. But it may not be like other employment before, which when the economic cycle turns around, new jobs are created, and for the year or two, those unemployed feel bad and unwanted and all of that. So if you know this is happening, will happen, what's your plan? Because in a time of crisis, the people with a plan are more likely to be listened to. One, because it shows some people have been paying attention, and two is you're solving a direct problem. What do we do with the unemployed? And you say, why not make them not unemployed? Why not say two days a week that they're no longer unemployment benefit, they're working as resilience and preparedness workers. But what do you do with them? Well, that's why you're doing the preparation. It says, how could they help? What's the background work? So you're saying, here you go, this is what you need. Another thing, as our financial crisis starts to develop, will probably be governments and central banks suddenly saying, oh God, we've got to get liquidity into the economy. You can do this in bad ways that just cause inflation. You can do it in useless ways that just prop up a dying industry. Or you can say, what would be the most useful things? Because remember, we're thinking about a world in where the timeline, we don't know how long it's going to be. There may not be lots of more money going in. So part of anticipating, being with the person of a plan, is prioritizing the critical. That's a sewage system. Yeah. Water, sewage, communications, food, all these sort of things. So you might say there's protection things you do. So if you have a nuclear power station and you want to say, well, what happens if the power goes? In other words, you can't, because nuclear power is part of a network. If the grid goes down or if there's other sort of things that it needs, how do you ensure that that doesn't become this thing lying under you? What do you need to do? That's why you need to spend the money now, because you mightn't have the opportunity in future. Or the mine tailing, or things that are dangerous. The other thing is protection, around can we get water? Or in the case of the sewage system, say there's a grid failure or something else. Is there something now that we can click into our sewage system that in a crisis we mightn't have energy for anything else, but there'll be some water flowing and some sewage working. So these are things that people will bring their diverse skills to because they're technical, but that's sort of things that exercises can illuminate. So that's an important piece of prep work. And the other thing is funding. And it's always, I know from doing these sort of things, people have these great ideas, and then it's like, yes, but it all costs money. Well, there's the one I kind of suggest tongue-in-cheek, but you never know. Most of what we call wealth in the world are abstract claims upon money and then goods and services and future expectations. So this is wrong, but I'm just using the figure because it doesn't really matter ultimately if you jump off a 100-story building or a 150-story building. The result is pretty similar. So they were saying that financial assets are worth 6 times more than the GDP of the world. This is area can never be turned into GDP. There isn't 6 times worth of world GDP to just like crash it out. And anyway, a lot of world GDP is occupied with people feeding themselves and doing the things they're doing. So that's going to vaporize, and literally vaporize because it can't deliver real goods and services. So if you have a really rich friend, or indeed a really rich enemy, what you might say to them is, you're mispricing risk. They might come after you. People might blame you for in a time of crisis. A better thing to do for you would be, because you're only going to be safe if your wider society and community are safe, is you give money into resilience building. But a more practical thing, you don't want to rely on the generosity of those who are most dedicated to accumulation, is to say a lot of these problems or predicament we have now about needing games, needing other types of plans, if people want to chat about things we need, they're going to be needed by other communities around the world. They're not there yet. I said I've used a game with communities. It's not great. It's pretty rubbish. You're grateful for there. So if you're starting off and saying, well, what can we do? Coming back to that idea of saying, how can I help? Help build the tools that communities and societies need to start addressing their own preparedness. And that's something that can be done. It just takes people. It takes people who get the ideas. It takes people who are committed. And that will be funding because it's needed and it's urgent. So my final 1.46 minutes will be the thing that's been said by Jem and others is, this stuff is traumatic. I've been doing it for over 15 years, and at times it doesn't stop being traumatic. We need to be careful with ourselves, with each other, with nature. And when we say cultivate or practice compassion, they aren't things you have, they're things you do. They're things you keep going back to. It's a practice, not an end. And in some way, I think it's important that this isn't obviously just to emphasize, it's not all technical, socioeconomic organizing. Part of why we do these things, I think, with all the uncertainties that are inherent within it, is because we're doing it with others, some of us we care, and we need to be mindful of that because we don't know the destination, but we know it's going to be hard. So I wish everybody well for the rest of this, and thank you very much.